All right. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. This is the first of a series of community meetings to discuss and really to explain what the fire district and the community, in conjunction with our stakeholder partners, the residents, and surrounding government agencies, what we think should go into our community wildfire prevention plan as part of an ongoing and interactive process. The goal of tonight is to explain the elements of the CWPP, to explain some of the fire science that went into developing the recommendations, the general prioritization that'll be further developed through a series of stakeholder meetings. The CWPP is made up of 5 distinct parts. I'll walk through those tonight, but really I am going to try to put some time and effort into explaining the science behind projected fire spread in this area that would lead and lend itself to destructive wildfire. Really breaking down the topography, the weather, the fuel loading, and what we have done. Because this CWPP is not being presented as a blank piece of paper, and there's 2 reasons for that. One is that many of those pieces of paper will be the same in every CWPP you ever see. They're very boilerplate, and there's not a lot of room for original thought there. And the second is that the district, the residents, our community, we're not new to this topic. This has been a topic of great study and concern for some time, and for at least the last 3 years, a real area of focus for the fire district. And in that regard, and not only having to do with history, but experience, we're very fortunate to be joined both tonight and in this project by our fire marshal, Jeff Isaacs, and by our community, preparedness manager, Dennis Rain. For those of you who don't know him, Fire Marshal Isaacs comes to us from CAL FIRE, where he was a division chief, and he has extensive experience in wildland fires, not only in our region, but throughout the state. And then Dennis comes to us from East Bay Parks, where he was the fire chief, to include being a first responder on the tunnel fire in 1991. So in that role, and then in his role in Parks, the issue of wildfire and the steps that can be taken to mitigate wildfire and its destructiveness. These are areas that he is well versed in, specific to this area. And then they, along with many other members of the district, are actively engaged in statewide mutual aid, where they've gained experience on fires in other parts of the state that allow them to come back and apply those lessons learned to this environment. So without any further ado, I've prepared more than a few slides, I'm afraid, that I will walk through. And as I said, the intent of tonight is to explain what the elements of the CWPP, explain our thoughts about wildfire in this area, and really to arm residents with the information they will need to take a look at the CWPP through the lens that we're attempting to write it. And to arm them to provide input. Certainly there'll be opportunity for questions tonight, but really our goal tonight is to do more of a presentation to explain what it is we're working on. And at the end, we'll talk about, for those who have not seen it already, about how residents can provide input. There is a form on our website where residents can provide input by specific sections or as within the broad topic. And we would encourage residents to do that in a measured manner, and would give us a chance to rack, stack, collate, identify duplicate questions, and really try to efficiently and on a large scale incorporate the input of our community. So without any further ado, I will start in here. All right, Dennis, can you confirm that you are seeing the white Community Wildfire Prevention Plan opening screen? Great, you're on mute, but I appreciate it. Okay, let's take a look here. Okay, all right, so for an agenda, we're gonna walk through these different elements. First, we're gonna talk about what is a CWPP, what goes into the development process. Then we're going to review fire behavior as it applies in the abstract, in general, really based on Rothermore's work for the spread of ground fire. And then we'll take a look at weather and topography in the abstract, and then we'll take a very close look at weather and topography as they apply to the district. And then we'll review fuel loading. And in fuel loading, in this case, we're talking about vegetation and homes, but we'll talk about why we're more concerned about vegetation than homes when it comes to the fuel model that is most likely to carry the fire. And then we'll talk at the end about how to provide input, about what ways residents can provide input on what we see as the plan as it exists today. Understand that everything we have done so far comes with a big, gigantic draft sign on it. We're very clear that we are not telling the community this is what it will be, but we also don't want to ignore the work that has been done to get us to this point. So this is a draft, but I would say it's an informed draft. And with that, let's start walking through these slides. Okay, so first we'll talk about what a CWPP is. Why does a community have one? So CWPPs were created by and recommended for communities in the wildland-urban interface by the Healthy Forest Act of 2003. And this act not only identified the need for it, it broke down the various elements, and it tied eligibility for certain federal grants to having a CWPP. Nationwide, the estimate is about 25% of communities that should have a CWPP have one, so the vast majority do not. And then the other piece of this is that most CWPPs are very boilerplate. They look very similar, and they include a lot of abstract statements, such as from one in our area that said, rural roads may not be able to support both emergency traffic and evacuations. Well, and why I agree with that sentiment, there isn't much that is actionable about that. And what we're trying to do with this CWPP is develop a shared understanding of wildfire hazards in our area, and really be able to come to agreement about what the hazards look like, and then prioritize mitigation projects in the form of an action plan, and then regularly come back and revisit this. And we believe about every 3 years is the right window where on a every 3-year basis, we will take a look at what has been done. We will assess the value of that. We will do some analytics based on using LiDAR and some ground-based capture to figure out what the new fuel model looks like, run the fire spread models across that fuel, see what the fire spread looks like, use that to quantify the value of the work that has been done in the preceding period, and use that to prioritize the next round of projects. If we are successful in that, I think we'll have created something that will have value to the community. I will be very clear, though, that the creation of a CWPP, no matter how much effort and time and energy and sweat and love and tears goes into it, it is still just paper. And it doesn't magically produce either the will to do the work. It doesn't magically wave away environmental restrictions or landowner concerns that limit access. And it also doesn't generate additional revenue and additional funding for the work. So while we believe there's an opportunity to do a lot of good things here, it is still going to take additional money. It's going to take additional resources and investment on the part of residents on the small parcels, and an ongoing commitment from the various government stakeholders and large landowners to either maintain their parcels or to enforce, in our case, enforce the fire code on parcels that are not compliant. So I want to be very clear that there are things that it is, and I think there's a lot of goodness here, but there are also things that is very clearly not. So a CWPP is made up of 5 sections. So it starts off with a fire district and area overview. In our case, this is pulled verbatim from our strategic operation plan, and that was done in 2016. And it has to do with the history of the district and the fact this is a Mediterranean climate and the development of the community. So all of that is in there. It's good, but it is not original thought. That's drawn from our SOC. The next piece is the wildfire hazard and risk in the WUI, wildland-urban interface. This is generally pretty standard stuff. Homes that are in or around wilderness areas are exposed to the risk of wildfire. I think that is known. And the Moraga and Orinda have been identified at communities of risk at wildfire from wildfire since 2001 and been included on the various maps that CAL FIRE publishes that show that. So there's nothing new there as far as the understanding and the awareness that this community is at risk. But that section includes a good definition of those sort of things. And then 3 is strategies for reducing risk in the wildland-urban interface. And those can really boil down to 3 different categories. One is fuel mitigation on large-scale projects, the creation of fuel breaks or shaded fuel breaks in this case, and other fuel reduction strategies to reduce the prevalence of combustive fuels in a wilderness area. The next is defensible space, creating up to 100 feet around homes where vegetation has been modified, either removed or changed in its configuration, so it is not available as a continuous fuel bed to draw fire into a home. And then home hardening, things like putting in ember-resistant vents, using strategies to replace combustible building materials, specifically wood shake roofs, and other strategies to reduce both the ignitability of homes and the prevalence of combustive fuels in continuous and unbroken fuel beds surrounding those homes. And then chapter 4, section 4, talks about action plan priorities. And that's, once again, that's a little bit more in the abstract. And then 5 is the action plan. And what we're going to talk about at this stage in the process is really up through number 4, the action plan priorities, speaking more in the abstract. The action plan, specific projects, and a timeline associated with those. In my opinion, it's a little early to start into that, because it's going to be necessary for us to come to consensus as a community about what we think about the first 4, really, and specifically number 4, before we get into the details of which projects first. And then the action plan is informed by maps, and I've added a bunch of those tonight that will talk us through the terrain analysis, an assessment of the surface fuels, an assessment of the ladder fuels, and then a review of parcel ownership. And this has to do with, it's much easier to deal with a single landowner who owns a large lot than lots of small holdings. And so there become some elements where, from a prioritization standpoint, it becomes a little pragmatic about where can we move the most quickly. And we can move the most quickly when we're dealing with large landowners, particularly if those large landowners are resource managers that come with not only a mandate, but staff and funding and approvals and environmental experience with environmental compliance that can speed the process of carrying out fuel mitigation work on a large scale. Okay, so for development process, so the first step in this was the district staff put together a draft CWPP. That draft CWPP was informed by some best practice models in our area: Marin County, Santa Clara County, Galitas, some other areas that have done really good ones of late. So we took a look at those and we pulled elements of that we thought were relevant to our community, where we share either the fuel or the environments or the topography. We pulled those together. We made some adjustments and some edits to match our understanding and what our experience suggests is the risk that our community is exposed to. And we presented that to the MOFD board in December to start the conversation. It was not intended to say, here is the CWPP, it is time to be approved. It was our way of informing the board that we are going to start this process. And the process really begins with the series of 3 community meetings, one for Orinda, one for Moraga, and one for Canyon and Bollinger, between now and February 4th. Following those meetings, which are, as I mentioned earlier, are intended to explain the CWPP, explain our thought process, and explain how we see the problem, there will be opportunities for community input. We think it will be most efficient and effective for those to occur via the link on our website and the form that is there, so that we can organize it and we can identify duplicate comments and so forth. And then there will be a series of meetings with stakeholders. So that's East Bay Mud, East Bay Parks, Caltrans, the school district, the city, the town, the large homeowner or the large parcel owners, the country clubs, et cetera. And then out of that, we will come back to the MOFD board for a public meeting, where we will present to the board what we believe the input received from as a result of these public meetings through the forum and from the stakeholders. And having spent more time studying this problem with the perspective of the input received, we will present to the MOFD board what we believe the CWPP should include. That obviously, as a public hearing, will include an opportunity for the public to offer input directly to the board, either in person or in writing in advance, at the point that the board feels, and that may be a meeting, it may be a series of meetings. That obviously, it depends on how contentious this is and how long it takes to achieve consensus regarding priorities. At a point when we've gotten the input and we've gotten it right, we hope the MOFD board will adopt it, at which point it'll go to the County Board of Supervisors for adoption. And at that point, we will have a CWPP in effect. And then our recommendation is that on a triennial basis, we will come back, we will assess the work done, we will assess changes in the environment. We'll assess changes, so that environmental factors that may have changed, specifically weather. We will assess vegetation changes, and we will assess the input and any construction, although that's a much smaller component in a built-out mature community such as this one. And then we'll assess the impact, the effect of the work that has been done in the 3 years since the plan was last revisited. And then we'd go through an abbreviated version of this same process, and then the updated CWPP would be adopted. And we think in this way, going forward, the community can have a plan, a single plan that can act as a guiding document or framework, if you will, to make sure that work is being done in an organized manner. It's being done to build upon previous work, and it's being done not in an ad hoc or scattershot basis, but it's being done in alignment with best practices and a good scientific understanding of where the threat lies, divided by a pragmatic assessment of where work can be done with the lowest risk of litigation, the least environmental impacts, the fewest restrictions with regard to access, and that being approval access from the owners, and then physical access, getting to the site. Areas that are easier to work on would obviously be the ones to start on first. So with that, let's talk a little bit about fire behavior basics. So a couple of things. For those who have seen me talk before, I apologize that you're going to hear a lot of the same things, but wildfire is relatively basic in concept. It is also widely misunderstood, and there are some basic premises. And before we get started, I'll just say, ask for everyone to please keep in mind, all fires start small. All fires need fuel, they need topography, and they need weather that are favorable to spread. And their spread rates are a factor of those three elements, and that's it. We know we cannot modify the weather, and we know we cannot modify the topography, which means fuel is the element over which we have some level of control. So with that, fire is measured, specifically wildfire, in flame length, spread rates, and fire line intensity. So how long are the flames, how fast is it moving, and how hot is it burning? As I mentioned before, topography, wind speed, which is really weather, but for our purposes, it's wind speed. Humidity plays a role as well, but wind speed's the big one. And available fuel are the things that come together to influence these spread rates. And the fuel availability has to do with the configuration, the size measured in hours, which we'll get to in a minute, and the fuel moisture, both live and dead fuel moisture. So as I mentioned, of these elements, only the fuel is the part that we have any control over. And without available fuel, a fire cannot burn in a given area. So all other things being equal, if fuel is removed or made unavailable, then fire cannot burn in that area. However, having removed the fuel from an area does not protect everything that is downwind of that point, because fire spreads not only through the ground component, which is the linear movement of fire from combustible item to combustible item, but it also moves through three-dimensional ember cast. And that's embers or firebrands that are carried aloft by winds and can travel great distances. And when they come to the ground, when they land on a receptive fuel bed, the pile of dead leaves, dead grass, a gutter filled with duff and litter, they start new fires, which they'll start small, but given time, they can grow to be large fires in their own case or in their own right. And I'll give an example later on, but in October of 2019, a fire burning in Vallejo jumped the Carquinez Strait through three-dimensional ember cast and ignited a subsequent fire 1.6 miles downwind near the Cummings Skyway. Just to give an idea that there is no one-stop shop or single step, magic bullet, if you will, of creating a moat around the district. While we think there is value in creating fuel breaks around the perimeter of the community, that's only one part of the solution because of three-dimensional ember cast. So a fuel break, while good, and we're proud of the one we've built, and we have plans to build more, it's only partially effective. And we'll come back to that theme later in the presentation. So the next thing here is available fuel becomes of greater concern when it's in proximity to values at risk. And in this case, by values at risk, we mean lives, we mean homes or other structures, and we mean valuable or sensitive environmental areas that need to be protected. So we want to reduce fuels when they're in proximity to those things. And we also want to reduce fuels in proximity to areas where firefighting resources can make a stand. Right? So if we reduce fuel in the middle of a large open area while the perimeter remains choked with vegetation near homes, Well, we haven't done much because while the fire won't burn with great intensity in the middle of that area, the middle of the area is not what we're worried about. We're worried about the perimeter where that area comes in proximity to homes and other values. Reducing fuel loads near defensible points, and this being places that firefighting resources can make a stand, is a great use of resources, because then that will allow our firefighters to be more effective while they're fighting a wildfire. And then we'll talk a little bit more about where we can and cannot fight fire based on how much risk we're willing to assume. And then defensible space near homes. Not only is that a good idea, not only is it a best practice, but the fire code and state law requires the construction of defensible space. And we'll talk some more about that. So it's not only a good idea, but it's an existing requirement. And we've got a lot of work to do in that front to get the entire district into compliance. So when fire is spreading through a continuous fuel bed, and there's some other factors we'll talk about having to do with fuel bed categorization, but fire builds momentum, if you will. So when it runs through a fuel bed, when the fuels are the same and they're available, fire builds intensity, it builds speed, and moves very quickly. But it needs runway, if you will. It needs a ramp. And when the fuel bed is broken up and it's no longer continuous, when we have created a varied mosaic of fuels, that slows the fire's intensity and its spread rate, because the fire has to stop and to start. And that also mimics the natural condition that was here before we excluded fire from the environment over 100 years ago, where you had a varied mosaic of fuels. And as a result of that, the frequent and low intensity fires, which burned every 3 to 5 years in this area, they were not very destructive because they never were able to gain and sustain great intensity because of that varied fuel mosaic. So our goal here is not to nuke the environment, to slick off all the vegetation and replace it with sterile rocks and bare dirt. There's reasons that's not correct either. The goal that we intend to capture through the CWPP is to create a varied fuel mosaic with additional fuel mitigation and reduction work in high risk, low cost areas and near homes, so that we can reduce the risk of wildfire while preserving the semi-rural characteristics of the community that are held so dear. And then the last point there is when we are looking at how we prioritize firefighting, and I believe we should prioritize along the same manner with the CWPP. First, we prioritize life, then we prioritize property, and third, we prioritize the environment. So we will make decisions that cause either the loss of property or destruction of sensitive elements of the environment in order to save life. And we will take risk with wildfire fighting resources in order to save lives. We will take risk, but less so to protect property and less so to protect sensitive elements of the environment. So it prioritizes, when you look at those three elements, it prioritizes our efforts to where they will have the greatest benefit, because homes can be rebuilt, environmental areas can be remediated, but lives can't be, people can't be returned if they perish as a result of exposure to wildfire. So when we're talking about wildfire fighting, I touched on this just briefly, but I think it's important to review. When we have available firefighting resources, we deploy them to protect values where they'll have the greatest positive impact, as in they will be able to either put out the most fire or move the most people to safety, depending on whether the fire can be put out, because fires can exceed our capacity to extinguish them under certain conditions, at which point our prioritization shifts to the evacuation of the residents who are in its path. We also put them in a place where they have the lowest negative impact. And in this case, we're specifically talking about negative impacts on the community's ability to evacuate. And I'm sure it's no surprise to anyone who has lived in this community for any length of time that our surface streets will not support a mass movement of the community. And they certainly won't support the mass movement of the community at the same time we try to flow large number of very large firefighting apparatus in the opposite direction to get to the fire. And so one of the considerations that we have to take when planning to fight fire in the community is how we get the resources to where they need to be to fight the fire without negatively impacting the members of the community that are attempting to evacuate. And that means there are going to be some areas we can't get to, or we can't get to as quickly because we have to take a more circuitous route. We have to come at it from the north, which means going towards the fire and potentially going through the fire to get to the areas in North Orinda, specifically in El Toyanal, or we're going to attempt to make a stand. So there are a number of elements that have to be considered there. It's not just as simple as saying, go get them. We got to send the firefighters out with a plan, and the plan has to recognize the competing demands on those surface streets. And then we have to take a look at how much risk are we exposing the firefighters to. On a north-facing slope in heavy overgrown vegetation with a continuous canopy and 100 years of decadent material on the ground, in a high wind, diablo wind condition with one way in, one way out, mid-slope, north-facing road, we probably cannot deploy firefighters to that area because they have no evacuation route, and they're very likely to be overrun by the fire. And now, one, we've exposed them to risk. We've diverted resources to go support them to try to get them out of that bad position. And they were highly unlikely to be successful because the conditions on a mid-slope road, on north-facing slope, and that sort of a fuel model are going to exceed their ability to put the fire out. And then the last 3 points here is that wildfire fighting is extremely mobile. At no time when you're fighting a wildfire does an engine stop and hook up to a hydrant and fight from a single position. Very mobile, requires staying ahead of a fire that is moving very quickly, very dynamic. And in our case, as we saw in the fires in 1923 and 1991, just to our west, fire is going to move very quickly. This is not an area that has multi-day siege fires. These are 12-hour fires in alignment with wind events, and they move with just explosive speed. That said, there are an awful lot of firefighting resources in the Bay Area. So the number of resources available to fight the fire will rapidly grow. And one of the things the fire district has been and will continue to work on is exercises with our surrounding agencies, Berkeley, El Cerrito, Kensington, Oakland, San Ramon Valley, Contra Costa County, to ensure that we all share a common understanding of how the problem will be solved. We have identified in advance the delineation of responsibility by geographic divisions. We've identified the communication systems that will be used that will allow us to incorporate outside area and other agencies such as East Bay Regional Park Fire District, CAL FIRE, and others who will be coming that we need to be incorporated into our plan, as well as agencies from throughout the Bay Area. And then because, as I mentioned before, those limited evacuation routes, we're going to end up with more resources than we have roads to deploy. And so we have to be very smart about how we time phase these deployments and how we bring resources in a manner that they don't negatively impact the community's ability to get out. So with that, a little bit of a primer on how we would fight fire, let's talk about weather and topography and factors that influence fire spread. So as a general statement, fires can be wind-driven, fuel-driven, or topography-driven. In our area, the vast majority of destructive fires are wind-driven, and those wind-driven events occur in the fall and early winter or late summer called Diablo wind events. We'll talk about that more in a minute. So to understand winds, we take a look at two measurements. There's 20-foot winds, which are commonly called surface winds, and then there's mid-flame height winds. And as that diagram shows in the inset there, winds aloft can be pushing at 70 to 100 miles an hour, and at 20-foot winds, 30 to 45 miles an hour. And by the time you get down to mid-flame height, depending on whether it's sheltered, partially sheltered, or fully sheltered, which has to do with the canopy, the winds are significantly lower. And the reason that matters is that the slope, not only the direction of the slope, but the type of vegetation on the slope, has a very real impact on how much wind is on the fire. A fire burning in the understory beneath a thick tree canopy is getting a fraction of the wind of a fire burning when weather or wind and topography and alignment through grass, where there's nothing sheltering it, it's getting the full value wind. So we see and the reason that matters is we have very sudden changes in fuel loading and fuel types depending on what slope you're on. In this area, generally speaking, if you are on a north-facing or east-facing slope, it's heavily overgrown with brush and trees. As soon as you move to a west-facing or a south-facing slope, grass predominates. And you get into fuel model 1 and 3, where you see grass with encroaching brush from here to there, but primarily grass, which will carry the fire. And the other piece I'd like to talk about with wind has to do with relative humidity. As I mentioned before, wind speed is one thing, but the amount of relative humidity or the moisture in the air also matters. And our general winds, which are offshore from the west, which typically and seasonally throughout the spring and summer pick up every afternoon, those are bringing moisture-laden air from the bay and the Pacific Ocean, and eventually they bring the fog. The winds we're really concerned about are those diablo winds, which are called onshore winds, which occur in the late summer, early fall, early winter, and they come from the north and the northeast, and they're bringing very dry air from the interior valleys. And we see that mattering when we get into the light flashy fuels, fine fuels that equalize with the ambient moisture in about an hour. And so we can see fuels becoming available that would not normally be available, which is why a high wind day in early summer with the fog coming right behind it is of much less concern when it comes to fire at the scale we're talking about here. So the Bay Area is subject to major diablo wind events in the late summer and fall. Down south, they're called Santa Anas. It's the same general phenomena. They come out of the north and northeast and are characterized by high winds and low relative humidity. And now they occur in the fall when we see fuel moisture levels very low because they had the fuels, the vegetation hasn't seen rain in months. And as a result of climate change, we see an ongoing compression of the rainy season so that the rains are ending sooner than they used to. I'm sure everyone remembers the wind event earlier this week. That was a major diablo wind event. But the reason it was not a major fire event was that there had been enough precipitation so far this year that we see green grass starting to come up, the brush and the trees are coming back into their growing season. The uptake of moisture is well underway. And so while we had all the weather conditions for a fire, the fuels were not dried out because of the recent precipitation. Obviously in the fall, the fuels haven't seen rain in so long that they're well dried out. And in this area, 1923, the Berkeley Hills Fire, which was the most destructive fire in the state history at that time. The 1970 Fish Fire, which was a significant fire it started right on the edge of the district and burned into Oakland. And then the 1991 Tunnel Fire, which burned right on the district's edge. And then the North Bay fires in 2017, 2018, and 2020. All of these were associated with diablo wind events. And 19 of the 20 most destructive fires in California history have occurred from August through December. So throughout the state, it's the exposure to these high wind events that bring about these destructive fires. And really sort of ominously, 15 of these most destructive fires have occurred in the last 5 years since 2015. New records are being set every year. And this year at 4.25 million acres burned was no exception. So on the left side here, you see an animation of what a diablo wind looks like. So coming out of the Great Basin and out of the Mountain West, you see this dry air. It runs down the Central Valley. It comes sweeping down slope over the Sierra Range. And then because of the break caused by the Delta, it finds an exit to the sea through the Bay Area. You see a similar phenomenon coming out of the large southwestern deserts through the Southern California area where they call them Santa Ana winds, and then a version of those, the sundowners in Santa Barbara. So that's the general phenomenon that creates those winds. And on the right side here, on the top, you see temperature, and on the bottom, you see humidity. This was from a district fire sensor that we were testing out about 2 years ago. And so this is at 1 in the morning in 2018. You see the normal evening drop of temperature and increase of humidity as the dew's coming in. And around 1 in the morning, over a very short period of time, humidity hit the floor and temperature went up at 1 in the morning. That was the onset of a diablo wind. So that's the event that we're worried about. That's the event that sets the stage for explosive fire growth. So topography plays a role here in that mid-flame height winds, which are the ones we're worried about, are increased as wind moves through draws and valleys, as it's compressed, just like water moving from a wide course to a narrow course. It increases speed and intensity as wind runs through these valleys. And we see increased fire behavior and runs through these valleys and draws in alignment with those increased winds. We also know that fire burns upslope faster due to convective and radiant preheating. So when you see, because heat rises, so when you see a wind and topography in alignment, as in wind is pushing uphill, fire is going to burn very, very quickly. We see increased spread rates. And the phenomenon, unfortunately for us, is during a diablo wind event, you can get violent downslope winds, where the wind is moving downslope so rapidly that it is laying the flames down, so that you might have 30 or 40 foot flame lengths, but the scorch height, as in the height above the ground that those flames are moving, is only a couple of feet. And at which point a downslope fire can burn just as fast as an upslope fire because the weather is in alignment with the topography with those rapidly moving downslope winds, laying the flames down low. And those high winds also, not only do they affect ground component where we see the alignment, but they can increase three-dimensional ember cast because those high winds will carry flaming firebrands or embers farther. And we certainly saw that during October of 2018 up in the Carquinez Strait. So next we'll talk about fuel loading. So the weather in the fall, those dry winds, the topography, when we see unsheltered fuels in either draws or valleys, or we see downslope winds coming into alignment with topography, those cause increased fire spread rates. So fuel load for our purposes is vegetation and structures. And structures we'll talk about in a minute, but we're primarily worried about vegetation. And fuel, we further divide it by categorizing it by availability, as in, is it available to burn? And that has to do with configuration, and that has to do with fuel moisture. And the fuel model, as in what type of fuel is it? So our good friend Rothermel took the time to categorize fuel into 13 different models. And for each of those, he figured out the characteristics. What is the tons per acre? What is the flame lengths? What are the expected spread rates on a certain slope with certain wind under certain temperature and certain fuel moistures? All of that's been calculated. And so what's done then for calculating fire spread is you take each pixel or each little grid, and you identify of the various vegetation types in that pixel, which of those is most likely to carry the fire. And the reason that matters is, and we take that picture I've included there on the right. So we see a sparse non-interlocking tree canopy. We see a lack of ladder fuels because the trees have no low-lying limbs. And we see fuel model 1 looks like 2 to maybe 3 foot grasses well cured underneath. So in this case, with wind, a fire will run rapidly through those grasses in the understory, and it will not burn the trees. Or if it burned the trees, it will burn them after the fact, after the main flaming front has passed through that area. So in this case, while there are trees there, and those trees under certain conditions could be considered fuel, that fuel is not likely to carry the fire, and it is not likely to contribute to the fire's spread rate because it's the grass that will be burning. And if you were to remove the trees, the grass would still burn. Whereas if you remove the grass, the trees would not burn. And so having identified the fuel that is most likely to carry the fire, and having done the calculations to figure out how fast that fire will spread, what will be the fire line intensity, then we can start moving forward with mitigation measures. So in this case, let's just say that's a 6 foot wide fire trail. If the flame lengths produced by that grass are predicted to be 12 feet, which they are, then that little trail is inadequate as a fire prevention or stopping or mitigating device. That road would have to be 15 feet wide. Or conversely, the sides of that road would have to be mowed to stubble height less than 3 inches for 5 to 10 feet on each side. And so in that manner, we can be smart and calculated and scientific about our prescriptions so that we can realistically carry them out. Because in this area, it is highly unlikely that we will get approval to run a bulldozer through parkland or watershed to widen that trail to 15 feet wide. But it is very likely we will get approval to run a flat deck mower down both sides to mow the shoulders of that road to create an effective fuel break. And then the last piece has to do with fuel moisture and configuration. So fuel moisture obviously has to do with how wet the fuel is. And that is either live fuel moisture or dead fuel moisture. Obviously, live fuel moisture has to do with things that are living. Seasonally, fuel moistures go up and go down. And the second one is dead fuel moisture. So dead grass is categorized as a 1 hour fuel. And 1 hour speaks to its ability to equalize its dead fuel moisture with the ambient environment in 1 hour. And in the case of grass, its moisture of extinction, that is the point at which it will not support combustion, is 12%. So that when the fog comes in the spring and early summer every day, within an hour of the fog arriving and the fog bringing with it 100% RH readings, relative humidity readings, within 1 hour, that grass will have absorbed enough moisture from the fog, from the ambient environment, that it is not available. It cannot burn. So it's just a further point about why our concern is primarily in the fall when we see those Diablo winds. The other piece that's important here is to take a look at the configuration. So a minute ago, I talked about using a flat deck mower on both sides of the road there. And there's no requirement after you have flat deck mowed to come out and rake it all up, because you haven't, while you have not removed the fuel, you've changed its configuration. And by laying it flat and reducing its exposure to oxygen, which is required to support fire, the burning, the chemistry of burning, by laying it flat, we have removed it by changing its configuration. Same idea when we chip something. We take standing dead wood, it's cut and chipped and broadcast back on the ground. The fuel is still there. We have not removed the tons per acre, but we've changed the configuration in a manner that makes it unavailable and reduce the fire load as a result. So this is just a quick example illustrating the point about flame length. So here, if we have, let's just say it's 30-foot flame height and the flame angle is low, the actual flame height is going to be low. So flame length is long, flame height is low because the flame angle is low, and the fire is just laid down and running across the ground. And here's an example from a fire up in the North Bay. And you see how those embers are just hugging the ground. And you'll note that while there is lots of fire, none of the trees are burning. The tree canopies are unaffected because the wind speeds are such that the fire is racing along through the ground fuels and is not climbing up into the trees. Part of that has to do with the absence of ladder fuels, and part of that has to do with the low scorch heights, that the wind is so high that the fire is just laid flat and it never has a chance to rise up into those canopies. So as I mentioned before, for each fuel model, it includes calculations for tons per acre, modeled spread rates and fire lines intensities. The higher the tons per acre, that typically means you have larger fuels, right? In light flashy fuels or grass, the tons per acre are relatively low compared to, say, timber. On the other hand, if you were in timber, those larger fuels, while they have a higher tons per acre, they have a lower spread rate. It takes longer for each one of those items to ignite, but you get a higher fire line intensity. Now there's exceptions to that, but that's forest stuff. That doesn't really apply to our Mediterranean climate and to the different species we have here. If we were in a homogeneous conifer forest in the Sierra Range or in the Great Basin, a different set of rules would apply. But for our purposes, when we get into larger fuels, we see lower spread rates, but higher fire line intensities. We also, when we're in grass, one of the benefits are, because it's so light and flashy, it really doesn't produce embers that will carry any particular distance. On the other hand, when fire moves out of the grass into the encroaching brush, which is prevalent throughout our area, then we get a high spread rate, we get a high fire line intensity, and we get significant ember production. So brush is high on our list of things we're concerned about, and it's very challenging to mitigate. Both from mechanically, it's hard to get in and do the work on it. It's very resilient. It comes back year after year. It's got an almost 12-foot root system that will regenerate year after year. And then also there are environmental concerns specific to Alameda whipsnake habitat that make removing brush more challenging. So we talked about the moisture of extinction. For grass, it's about 12%. For brush, it's approximately 19%. And then the cardinal direction of the slope affects not only the fuel type, we talked about the difference between north-facing slopes and south-facing slopes, but it also has to do with the moisture. A north-facing slope is not getting full value sun until much later in the summer, and therefore will have a higher fuel moistures. It also has higher density and higher fuel loads, but we'll tend to see south and west-facing slopes curing sooner in the season. So here's an example from Briones. We see the south-facing slopes where grass predominates. On the right there, we see the north-facing slope with heavy brush and various bay laurel oak mix. And we also wanted to point out here, though, if you look down in the low ground here, this is a great example of where we categorize the fuel most likely to carry the fire. So a fire running down slope will burn through these areas where you see the tree canopy. It'll burn through the ground story, the ground cover, the ground fuels underneath that, but much more rapidly it will burn around them. And so then you would see a pocket of burning down there in that low spot as the main fire front had moved on, and you get these isolated pockets left behind that continue to burn. And while they are burning, they're not contributing to the spread rate. They're not carrying the fire, if you will. Just to touch briefly on structures, this is a picture from Coffey Park in Santa Rosa from 2017. So structures can and will burn in a wildfire. That's undeniable. However, they're very unlikely, particularly in our community, to be the fuel that is most likely to carry the fire. So in Coffey Park, when the fire jumped 101 and it transitioned into that neighborhood, it was no longer being carried by vegetation because there was very little vegetation in Coffey Park to carry the fire. But the distinction there is in Coffey Park, those lots are about a 0.12, a twelfth of an acre, or 0.12 of an acre, about a give or take, up to 0.15 acre, depending on the lot. And the homes, eave to eave, is measured in feet, and it's very flat. So when the wind ran through there, it was able to move the fire. It was structure to structure ignition. As a home ignited, fire was spreading from that home to the next home, and it spread through the entire area. In our community, that's just not the case. The lots are much larger. There's significant offsets to the property lines. And then there's varied terrain, meaning that while there are isolated locations where it is possible that there would be structure to structure ignition, it's very, very unlikely. So from our perspective, while homes will burn, they're not going to be the thing that carries the fire. And just like in that example from Briones we just looked at, fire will run through carried by the vegetation, and then behind it, heavier fuels and homes will continue to burn, but they will not be the element that is carrying the fire at a large scale. Just another example. So this is from Paradise. I'm sure this is a picture everyone has seen before, and the destruction of the community there. But the thing to note, this has to do with both embercast and the ground component, ground fuels. If you look in the background behind the destruction where clearly a catastrophic fire occurred, the tree canopy is intact on all of those trees. This is just another case of where the fuel most likely to carry the fire was either the ground fuels, as in the fire ran underneath these trees, or it was three-dimensional embercast where embers were able to find a gap and penetrate inside the building envelope and ignite that structure, which then most likely ignited the structures around it. So it's just something as a way of discussing about where the problem lies and how we prioritize our efforts. A fire running through the ground fuels and embercast are the elements that I believe and that we believe are most likely to threaten our community. So this is from the California Forest Observatory. It's a product SALO has put together. It goes back to 2016. And they're using satellites to do a number of things, canopy bulk density, the layers. But really the one here we're looking at is the prevalence of ladder fuel. And so as we look at this, we see ladder fuel density, obviously very high up in the East Bay Hills. It's high up in some areas of the watershed. And then there's parts of Orinda and up and around the reservoir where we see pretty high ladder fuel density. But the element we're really concerned about is the surface fuel inventory. And so here, dark is bad. Darker is a higher score, higher surface fuels. And as we zoom in, we see there's some areas, say up here by Bear Creek and at the end of Happy Valley Road, and some other areas of the community where there's very high surface fuel density. And as we zoom in further, here we see up at the end of Dalewood, we see some areas where the imagery shows what was a very high surface fuel density from a thick, mature coyote brush stand that previously existed there. So this is one of the tools, certainly the most accessible tool that we use to assess the fuel loading in an area, the available fuel loading, which then we run through the calculator of topography and expected weather to identify where do we see high surface fuel loading in topography that will support high winds during a Diablo wind event. And then we start to do the calculation about what that fire would do from that point. And if that fire is going to do a lot of damage, then that becomes a priority project. In this particular case, this was a priority project. And we were able, through the North Orinda Shaded Fuel Break and a significant investment of fire mitigation resources on the part of the Orinda Downs HOA, we were able to mitigate that entire field and are currently planning on how to put prescribed fire on the ground to maintain it as things start to grow back. So that was a little bit of a precursor to say, how do we take all of that information and how do we figure out what we expect fire to do in this area? Well, the first thing we do is we start with the CAL FIRE's fire hazard severity zone maps in the LRA. So on the left side, we see what they did for the whole county. And on the right side, we see the blow up from the 2007 draft maps, red showing the very high fire hazard severity areas, orange showing the high fire hazard severity areas, and the yellow showing moderate. So that was the 2007 draft maps. We use that as a starting point. Obviously, one, that's dated, and two, it's at a macro scale. Here's the 2009 final maps. You note that the red areas shrank a little bit, but El Toyanal, the areas just the south of Ladderwasser and up in sort of the ends of Sleepy Hollow and Lost Valley stand out, as well as Highway 24 and some areas on St. Stephen's, stand out as areas that CAL FIRE says are very high fire hazard severity zones and are of concern. So that is another element we use, with a little bit of a caveat that this is at a macro scale. It is done at a statewide level, but it is a good starting point to guide our investigation about where the greatest concern is. So as we look at the topography of Orinda, a couple of things stand out. As I was talking about up at the end of Lombardy there in the Orinda Downs, there's a major draw that runs north-south crossing Bear Creek Road, choked with brush and in alignment with those north winds. We see the same thing coming down from Sleepy Hollow Swim and Tennis Club. We see the same thing down through Wagner Ranch, where that major drainage that runs along Camino Pablo and San Pablo Dam has the effect of funneling winds from north to south. Similar things coming down Minor, where any wind that's coming down through the downs in Sleepy Hollow is going to be funneled out the Ladderwasser Creek watershed. Similar on Glorieta, coming down through Orinda and Moraga Way on that major north-south topographical feature there. And then again, up by the nursery, up into the Wilder development. And so those are some areas where you would expect to see winds being funneled. And then as well, all of the north-facing slopes, which by virtue of their exposure to a major wind event and the heavier vegetation that we typically see on north-facing slopes, are of concern from a topography standpoint when it is in alignment with weather. So having done that, we then take and we run some fire spread models. So this is a case, you see the reservoir here, the Briones Reservoir, and the little orange triangle there. So we modeled 77-degree temperatures, 8% relative humidity, and 15-mile-an-hour winds out of the northeast. And we started a fire and ran it across the landscape. So, okay, what will this fire do? Where is it going to go? And we note at the couple-hour mark, as it hits Bear Creek Road there, it finds some of those gaps where you see a topographical feature that will funnel the wind, and we see high fuel loading and concentrations that will push the fire across that very wide road. That's a significant road for a fire to jump, especially on the causeway there where it's elevated. So that was the starting point, and this was a calculation and a modeling we did for the North Orinda Shaded Fuel Break. So then we came back, and this is done with support of John Radke's a district resident and a professor at Cal who does this stuff a lot. Then you come back and you run the same fire model, and you do it after having modeled fuel reduction efforts along the shoulders of Bear Creek Road. And you'll note in the model at the bottom, all other conditions being the same, the modification of those fuels at those selected points along Bear Creek Road caused the modeled fire to hold or to check up on the north side of the road. So if a fire burns out of the watershed and is held at the road, we're all going to say, close call, good thing we didn't jump the road. And while there will be some burned grass and there'll be some watershed issues to be corrected, we will have avoided a major loss, and this will be a good thing. This will buy time. The fact that the fire is hanging up at the road, it will buy time for firefighting resources to respond, for the residents to evacuate, and for us to mitigate this fire. So this is the goal of our projects, is identifying, we don't need to be able to prevent a fire from burning anywhere in the Briones watershed. That's just not realistic. We're not ever going to be able to prevent things that could cause ignitions on the roadside, but we do these targeted fuel reduction efforts along in the right place so that a major fire does not jump the road and does not cause loss of life or destruction of property. The next element that goes into the prioritization of these things is an assessment of the traffic flow. What are the evacuation routes out of our community? So this is Moraga, Orinda, and Canyon. This is the entire fire district. And every roof in the district is assigned a value of 1, and a flow analyzer is used to map that roof's most efficient route to a freeway on-ramp. And those are depicted by the different colors you see there. And as everyone knows, there's only a couple ways out of town. And in the case of downtown Orinda at the BART station, an awful lot of members of our community, both Moraga and Orinda, need to flow out through that single point. And similarly, if you look at Sleepy Hollow and the Downs and the sort of upper minor, about 1,500 homes are going to flow out minor through the golf course out to Camino Pablo. So we start to take a look at what effect a fire would have on these evacuation routes. And what is the likelihood that a fire, if unchecked, will cross those evacuation routes, closing them? How many people upstream would be negatively affected and do not have an alternate way out? And that's one of the ways we're able to prioritize projects to where we see the greatest good to come from the allocation of the limited resources. And then the last piece that I talked about just at the beginning, this is a close-up of a map we've produced that shows all the parcels in the district that are greater than 10 acres and who owns them. And this is a good way to be able to come in and take a look at, okay, where are the areas that with one contact, outreach with one resident, one HOA, one absentee landlord, or one resource agency that owns this land, can we move forward? Which is much more efficient and allows us to move much more quickly than the laborious and painstaking effort of going door to door, a quarter acre at a time. And that's not to suggest that the quarter acre at a time work isn't important, but this is a case where we can see large scale improvements relatively quickly. And it also is called out because almost none of these parcels would be appropriate for a one size fits all solution. These require a unique and customized collaboration with the landowners or land managers to figure out how to not only get them into compliance on the front end, but how to sustain and maintain that over time. So this is another element that I believe is worth treating separately, having to do with how we approach these large parcels and treat them differently. Not to say the standards don't apply, but I think the approach is a little different in the prioritization, moving these up in the prioritization. Because getting a 150 acre HOA parcel, as an example, getting a plan in place for that 157 acres, in that case, that's an awful lot of small parcels to meet that same acreage. We prioritize really by proximity to the northern perimeter of the community. And if we have areas where like Orinda Woods, where they're linear, running along the freeway, tremendously helpful to get those into compliance because there's an awful lot of downstream benefit for all the residents who either live downstream of there or will pass through that area or whose evacuation routes pass downstream of there, that if those areas act as large fuel breaks within the community, that is something from which we can anchor and can use to develop our other projects. All right, so having to do with the prioritization of projects. So first I'd like to talk about what we have been and are continuing to do, because as I mentioned at the beginning, this process isn't starting with a blank piece of paper, because we've been working on this for a while, and we believe it's beneficial that whatever is come up with through the CWPP development process builds upon the work that has been done to date. So from the top, the North Orinda Shaded Fuel Break, and I've got a slide if anyone is not familiar about that, but I assume at this point everyone has heard of it. We continue to work with Caltrans about their obligations to maintain the state-owned land on the roadside of Highway 24. There have been a significant number of fire starts on state highways, both in the district and throughout the county. That is a work in progress. We are engaged in meaningful conversation with support of our local, state level, and local elected officials, but we're not done. There's still more work to be done, and there's still more fuel to be removed just to bring the roadsides of the state highways into compliance with Caltrans' own vegetation management requirements. This isn't us telling them what they need to do. This is their own standards that those areas do not meet. We continue to work on evacuation route inspections, this being both inspections and citations for private parcels that front an evacuation route, doing the roadside clearance in those areas. We continue to offer chipping support to neighborhoods and areas that are cutting and piling, and we come out and we chip. And we're making aggressive use of prescribed fire among other things, using it to maintain the work that has been done before. The pictures you see there, the bottom there is the macerator we brought out on Bear Ridge, working in partnership with the HOA who owns the land. As part of the North Orinda Shaded Fuel Break, we brought those macerators out. A year and a half later, we're out there burning the stuff that had grown back already. So it went from a hill of chips to a hill dotted with new coyote brush. And part of that is an initiative working with the California Native Plant Society to convert those brush areas to native fire-resistant grasses. Under Dennis Rain's direction, staff, after it was macerated, went out and spread native grass and wildflower mix that was then used as once it cured this fall, was then used as the substrate to carry the fire that you see in that top picture that scorched that regrowth of the coyote brush. And that was all done in conjunction with the onset of a rainstorm that basically did the mop up for us. A very, very tidy operation. We intend to continue that. We're working a similar operation behind Miramonte High School, where we're attempting to burn standing mature coyote brush and replace that with seeds to convert that back to native grasslands. And then the last piece on prescribed fire, not only using it for maintenance of work that's previously been done, but using it in conjunction where the topography and the separation supports it with HOAs and other large landowners, that as they have crews out cutting brush, rather than having to haul it and chip it, which is incredibly laborious and time consuming, those crews simply stack and pile, report the location to us after it's sat for 60 days to cure with approval from the Bay Area Air Quality Management District. Our staff goes out and pile burns them. And that way we can reduce the fuel, reduce the available fuel, reduce the time and expense it takes to haul and to dump or to broadcast, and allow those crews to be more effective and efficient as they're able to cover more ground. So we're able to do more with less by returning fire to the landscape. And that also sets the stage for maintenance of those areas as things grow back, using prescribed fire on a recurring basis in an attempt to match the naturally occurring 3 to 5 year cycle. Just a quick review, the North Orinda Shaded Fuel Break, 19.3 miles, 1,475 acres. It ran from basically from Pleasant Hill to up to the Berkeley El Cerrito border there on the end of Nimitz Way. That project was successful, and we not only did we learn a lot from it, but we have submitted requests to the state for follow-on funding to expand it. I'll talk about that more in a minute. That was our initial attempt at creating a fuel break or a perimeter along the northern edge of the district to slow or stop a fire spreading from the Briones watershed into the populated areas of the district, the ground component, that is. Then as far as maintenance, this was in April of this year out along Wildcat Creek Road, where we did a significant, or Wildcat Canyon Road, where we did a significant amount of fuel reduction work as part of the North Orinda Shaded Fuel Break. This is the team out in April working in conjunction with our partners from East Bay Parks and East Bay Mud, whose biologists had to sign off on it, putting low intensity ground fire in there to clean up the duff and litter that was left behind from the trimming and limbing and understory fuel clearance efforts that had occurred the previous summer, summer of 19, as part of the North Orinda Shaded Fuel Break. That's right at the Horsemen's Association. 3 to 4 weeks later, it was hard to tell that burning had been done. Now you could not tell. It just looks, has a park-like setting. Very environmentally correct, appropriate for this area. Very little damage. Does produce some smoke, but of the available ways to remove that duff and litter, this is by far the most effective. This is an example from the intersection of Sundown Terrace and Happy Valley from this summer, where we were able to put crews on the ground to burn off a section of the grass in proximity to those homes right at that critical intersection. And this was done to thicken the work, thicken the line for the North Orinda Shaded Fuel Break. It was done in conjunction with North Orinda Shaded Fuel Break funded efforts to reduce the overhanging trees along that route. And it was done in recognition of that is the critical intersection for the residents of Orinda View and the residents of sort of the eastern Dalewood or Orinda Downs area. That's the only way out through that intersection. And so by doing some targeted fuel reduction of those large grassy areas, we think we're able to protect that intersection because there's nothing there to burn for the remainder of this season. So I will not belabor these, but these are the 7 lines of effort that were identified in our 2018 Wildfire Prevention Strategic Plan. I still believe these are appropriate to guiding our overall efforts, and they are intended, the CWPP is intended to be informed by these. Not all these are appropriate to be included in the CWPP, but I think when taken together, these 7 lines of effort lay out a plan to a comprehensive and overarching strategy to reducing our community's exposure to wildfire. There is no one silver bullet here. It's going to take all of the above by all residents, and we think these 7 lines of effort lay those out. So when we get into prioritizing projects, the thought process behind this, and this is intended as an explanation, is that we need to be able to run micro and macro as parallel lines of effort. So while we will continue at the fire district level to focus on organizing, getting funding for, and executing large projects on the perimeter, expanding our perimeter work on the North Orinda Shaded Fuel Break, and working through enforcement, education, and resource partnering, work on those interior islands. So as an example, a owner has a 10-acre interior island. We worked with them to identify ways that they could do where their work would go the farthest and where they could pile burn instead of haul, or build piles, which we subsequently burned, and worked in a coordinated manner to identify a pathway to bring their parcel into compliance while reducing the exposure to wildfire risk in the surrounding area. At the same time, in parallel to that, I think it is critical that we move forward with every small parcel, this being really parcels between less than 3 acres, but really 1 acre and less, that all of these small parcels, it's critical that folks are doing their defensible space work and they're doing home hardening. And the challenge we have is that with the resources available, and these are the same folks, the team that's running the chipper is also out doing inspections and citations. And when residents are aware of the requirement but just aren't doing it, that draws resources away from productive things they could do, like running the chipper or educating other residents. And it's really, I think it's critical that we are eyes wide open, that the work on the perimeter and those interior islands, while important, and the work with the large landowners and other stakeholders such as Caltrans is important, and we will continue to do that. That does not absolve everyone else from the requirement to do defensible space work and home hardening, so that we harden the community both from without and within, so that we are protected not only from the ground component of fire, but from 3-dimensional ember cast. And we have built redundancy into the system so that this community is resilient in the face of a large-scale fire. So for the prioritization of those large projects, we look first at the greatest risk. So what is the greatest risk to lives? Both lives that are in place, as in homes, and lives that are being evacuated. So exposure to homes and exposure on evacuation routes. Then we next look at risk to property. How many homes are exposed to wildfire risk in this area? And then lastly, we look at risk to responders. If there is work we can do at a critical intersection or along the roadside that will make not only the access and egress from the site more certain and therefore safer, but increase the probability of success for that crew to fight fire at that location, there's a real benefit to that as well. And then we also try to run these through the assessment of lowest cost. And lowest cost measured in a number of ways. Is there approval to work on the site? Depending on who owns the site and what either plans or habitat management plans are in effect, approval to do work on the site is not always a foregone conclusion. And then site access. Can you get in there? If there is say portions of El Toyanal, tremendously steep, very overgrown, very little access, just getting to the site to do the work is a major project in itself. And while that doesn't mean that it doesn't need to be done and it shouldn't be considered, it is another element though, to say how much effort will it take to accomplish how much good in this area, and how much of that effort will be spent just trying to get to the point where the fuel mitigation work will occur. And if you can get there, what equipment can you get there? Because people with hand tools, the production rates are much, much lower than folks with equipment. If you can get equipment in there, the work will go much faster. And then what is the fuel type? Are we talking, is it grass? Well, grass can be mowed, but there's no residual value on that because it grows back the next year. Is it brush? And if it's brush, how thick is the brush? Does it have to be hauled, or can it be stacked and burned there? What are the production rates going to be for the crews that are working in those areas? On the North Orinda shaded fuel break, we're using a 20-man crew, and that 20-man crew could do between 1 to 3 acres per day, depending on the fuel type. And they were working their tails off. At the same time, though, 2 folks running those macerators, that orange macerators with it has a macerating forestry head on an extending arm. With 2 of those, they could do 5 to 7 acres of the thickest brush you'd ever seen. And the limiting factor was how fast they can swing. So it really depends on what the fuel model is, what the access is, how many people can we get in there, and what work are they able to do? What are the environmental restrictions? All of that goes into the calculator of how much work can be done, what will be the benefit of that work, and what's the cost per unit in that area. And then I believe it's important to expand upon our previous projects. As those spread, we start to see additional benefits and we start to create a varied mosaic. When it's just a project here and a project there, and they're not tied together and there isn't an overarching plan, fire will just run around those islands. And while that little island might be somewhat protected, it's also very likely to be overrun by fire that exceeds the design parameters of what that project was intended to stop. So we talked very early on, you may recall, I guess an hour ago now, about proximity to values at risk for projects. So we want to do fuel mitigation that is near the values at risk, understanding that we can't eliminate all of the ember producing fuels and that fire can travel a very far distance. You'll note there the Google map measurement showing it's 1.6 miles from where the fire in Vallejo was to where the ember ignited by the Cummings Skyway. That's a very long way for fire to travel over a body of water. So I don't think, I assume we can all agree that it's not possible to remove every ember producing fuel within 1.6 miles of the district. So it is also important then that we focus internally on the reduction of receptive fuel beds, right? Those collections of uncut dry grass, of duff and litter, other things that will, that when an ember lands on them will ignite and will start fires in their own rights. And it's particularly important that that work begins and is concentrated near homes and near evacuation routes, and then works outward from those points with the goal of creating a varied fuel mosaic at a community level. So that just like the fuels in an area where fire has not been excluded as it has been in our area, and just like this area looked like before it was developed and built out as a residential area, where every 3 to 5 years a low intensity fire comes through and it doesn't do a lot of damage and it never picks up a real head of steam or builds any momentum because the fuel mosaic is varied. There's a little fuel here, a little more there, and it can have little flare-ups and so forth, but it never develops into this roaring thing that is unstoppable that you see when it gets into a continuous fuel bed and high fuel loads. And then the last piece there is we absolutely have to be eyes wide open that we are unable to do work in sensitive areas, nor should we. Protecting of those sensitive areas, those environmentally sensitive sites, is not only required, but it's critical to the long-term sustainability of this project. In many of those areas, specifically riparian areas or watersheds, there's a very low chance of a fire burning. And just because there's fuel down there doesn't mean it's available, because it's generally moist year-round because of access to water. So from a prioritization of projects, what we've been working on, what I believe our place to start is the large parcels north of the populated areas. So this is the land owned by East Bay Mud. They've been a very good partner. They have a long-term habitat management plan. They have staff, they have biologists, they have a long-term plan that is in place and agreed. Obviously, the environment has changed since that plan was written in 2001. We've seen increasing fires, the compression of the rainy season. So there certainly is more work to be done, but they are a good partner. County Roads has an obligation to maintain the roadside. Roadside work is one of the most effective places work can be done. Not only does it build upon the fire resistant characteristics of the roadside, but it's easily accessible and you can get equipment to it. And generally speaking, there's certainly exceptions to that, but generally speaking, there are very few environmental restrictions immediately adjacent to an improved surface road because there's very few things that can survive right next to where vehicles are regularly traveling. So there's exceptions to that, but as a general statement, road shoulders are generally permissive environments to work. And then the large parcels, either private or publicly owned, that run along the north edge of the district. So the Orinda Downs HOA, the Sleepy Hollow Swim and Tennis, Bear Ridge Homeowners, and then Sleepy Hollow and Wagner Ranch Schools. And if you connect the dots of all those parcels with some intervening East Bay mud land, it starts to form a very thick band around the north end of the district. And that thick band will slow or stop the ground component of fire. and will buy time for the orderly evacuation of residents and the aggregation of an effective firefighting force. And if that is being done in conjunction with the hardening effect of fuel mitigation work to create defensible space on small parcels, then all of a sudden, our community starts to be very resilient in the face of wildfire, which I think is a good thing. Next one down, Highway 24 roadside. As I mentioned before, this is an ongoing project where we have not given up, but we haven't won yet either. Then those large interior parcels we saw on the map, there's some big sections, some of which are undeveloped, some of which have a single home in them, some of which are publicly owned, that absolutely require work. As you saw on the map, we know where they are. We're in contact with the owners, and they either have gotten into compliance or are on a pathway to do so. And then roadside clearance throughout the district. I like to focus on that for a couple of reasons. One, there is a clear benefit to the community. If you do your roadside work, the people upstream of you are not negatively impacted by non-compliant vegetation on your parcel. The fire code requires 3 feet back, 15 feet up from the edge of the road everywhere. Clearly, we have a long way to go to get there, but it's a great way to start. And it also is a manageable first chunk for residents. If you live on a large slope that you've never, a large sloped lot where you've never done any work, it is a daunting endeavor to start in on making your parcel compliant. On the other hand, you're 80 to 100 feet of roadside. That's a much more manageable chunk, especially when done either in conjunction with your neighbors and working with our chipper program, or even better yet, calling Republic for a large, with the 4 times per year that every trash customer rates a large pickup of green waste, or the larger can which you can get, you've already paid for. Great way to start in on doing fuel mitigation and reduction. And then, as mentioned before, defensible space and home hardening. This is not only a best practice, it's a requirement. And for those who are doing that, we think it's a phenomenal idea to join the many Moraga and Orinda residents who have already formed NFPA Firewise USA neighborhoods, and in doing that are recognized through the NFPA's program of record as being participants and following best practices in wildfire risk reduction, which is tremendously helpful as an element you can introduce with your homeowner's insurance company, to show that you and your neighbors are moving in the right direction in this regard. This is what we have pending for grant requests. That I certainly have answered or been asked many, many times. What grants are available and what are we doing? The North Orinda Shaded Fuel Break was our big one. That was $4.25 million, although that's all spent now. On 2019, we submitted a grant request for $8 million to extend the North Orinda Shaded Fuel Break, essentially from Orinda Bart up to Cal Shakes in Siesta Valley, wrapping around Wilder to Lost Valley, then down around Indian Valley, and out around Sanders, out around and up to Bollinger and St. Mary's. That in 2019-20, no projects were funded beyond about a $50,000 range. So this project was not selected. However, we are continuing to engage with both local, state elected and CAL FIRE officials. As the governor moves forward with his recently announced proposal to put $1 billion or more into wildfire safety, we think this project is worthy of consideration. We think our success on the North Orinda Shaded Fuel Break makes a pretty powerful case, and that this is a project that will benefit not only this district, but will benefit all the residents of the Oakland Hills and Piedmont, Castro Valley, Lafayette, all the folks around us from who would be affected by a fire either coming out of the district or emanating from the peripheral areas of the district. So we continue to push forward with that. And then at a much smaller scale, but in many ways more exciting, our fire marshal is a member of the Davila Fire Safe Council Board and has been very effective advocating for projects in the district, which are about $5,000 per project. A really great local success story built on the backs of 2 highly energetic and motivated community organizers up in the Sleepy Hollow neighborhood, where we're able to take a small grant in conjunction with all of their really tremendous community organizing efforts and support from the district in the form of the chipper to launch the No Juniper Left Behind initiative, where they went and smacked the heck out of the vegetation in that community. And that very small grant was a galvanizing element that brought the community together And with some really creative strategies and a lot of hard work on their part, they were able to leverage that to do a lot of good things. We continue to look for projects like that, and we continue to advocate for funding to expand upon that success. One of the challenges we have, of course, as a fire district is we're not very good at organizing neighborhoods, and we need help from the community as far as emulating best practices when those are found, and people who understand the problem and who believe in it, acting out there, spreading the good word, and encouraging people to organize and to apply for these projects in which we are happy to partner. But it's very challenging for us to do the organizational part at the community level to get the folks together in the first place. Defensible space, just a quick brief touch on this. I've already said it a couple of times. It's required by the fire code and state law, as well as being a best practice. The beneficiary is the resident who's doing the work. And with the notice of exception, that exemption that the district filed last July, that waives CEQA on fuel mitigation work from the standard 35 feet to 100 feet from homes within the district. There are a few minor exceptions to that having to do with the deliberate take of rare endangered species or the sedimentation of surface waters. But generally speaking, that means that within 100 feet of your home, you are absolutely not only authorized, but in some cases required to go out and follow those best practices for fuel reduction. And this is one of those things where, every little bit helps. It's not all or nothing. We encourage residents to start close to the home, start removing what you can, either as your sweat equity or your resources to hire people enable, and start working your way out from the home. But start somewhere. Just because you haven't done it all on the first day doesn't mean that little bit you didn't do was not helpful. We need a lot more of this throughout the district. And really the last piece here to talk about sort of the best practices and how we prevent the spread of three-dimensional embercast igniting homes downwind. Replacing your existing vents with ember-resistant vents, very cost-effective, very effective at preventing the intrusion of embers into the void spaces of your home. And then there are not very many of them left, but the few homes with wood shake roofs, those absolutely burn homes down. We encourage folks to replace them, and we've been working with the city on some Measure R options to financially incentivize ember-resistant vent replacement. It's not all that expensive for the hardware, and it's very quick to do. We encourage everyone to do that as part of this plan, because taken in conjunction with the defensible space work, you start to harden those homes to where that three-dimensional ember cast becomes not harmless, but certainly not as catastrophically destructive. And that buys time for us to get everyone out, to get firefighting resources in. And it makes our fuel reduction efforts on the perimeter, the construction of those fuel breaks, it makes those far more effective because the fire isn't jumping the line, if you will. Okay, so in summary, well, I guess in summary, here it is. So we're working on large projects to create and maintain the perimeter, emphasizing in those high fire risk and low cost areas to the north. We continue to seek additional grant applications, continue to work with those large property owners inside the perimeter and Caltrans for Highway 24, continue to enforce and request and encourage all residents to remove the fuel along the road or the street in front of their homes where their parcels front it. And then throughout the district, all small parcels working on their defensible space and home hardening, while we will continue in partnership with our friends in the police department and county OES, continue to work on evacuation planning and exercises so that we can, if and or when this happens, we can get the community out in the most efficient manner so that we don't find that the problem is, as the fire is unfolding, that's not the time to start figuring out what needs to be done, figuring out how we're going to exchange information. We're regularly involved in evacuation planning and exercises to build that familiarity, establish those communication pipelines, and to ensure the processes are well understood by all parties involved so that nothing gets lost or falls between the cracks at the moment of need. So the last piece I'd like to cover here is how to provide input. So there are the 3 public meetings. As I said, these are more intended to explain what we're trying to do so that as folks read the CWPP, they're informed by the intent behind when it was written and what we're trying to do. The next one is for Canyon and Bollinger on the 28th, then Moraga on February 4th, Then there'll be the MOFD board meeting on February 17th will be when we come back with our initial cut. And the MOFD board has indicated a desire to hold a separate public hearing dedicated specifically to this topic. So it's not crowded out by anything else on the agenda. And February 17th, we will identify based on whether or not we're ready from the input or whether more time is needed, but we'll provide a status update on February 17th and chart the way forward. There's a comment form that the link is there. You can also find it on our website under announcements where it says Community Wildfire Protection Plan, Community Meetings. The little blue arrow there in my inset shows at the bottom. There's a link saying provide input. There's a form there where you can provide input in the abstract or around a specific area. And then following the hearings and the review of any input provided in the stakeholder meetings, at a point down the road, there will be an adoption hearing. Then the board will hear from staff, we'll hear from the community, and we'll decide either to adopt, to amend, or to deny. And then it will go to the Board of Supervisors. And at that point, we would have our first CWPP and be about 3 years out from the next run at it. So that concludes what I had to say for tonight. Thank everyone for, there's a lot of talking, for sitting through that. Dennis or Jeff, I think you've been monitoring the chat. Are there any questions we should take from the chat before we open up for anything else?
Hey, Chief, this is Isaacs. There's been a couple questions about will the slides be available or will this presentation be available?
Absolutely. Well, so the recording, this is being recorded. The recording will be up on our YouTube channel, and the link will be provided on our website. And then we'll also put the what's it called, the slides. So we certainly can make those available on our website. Before I open up chat, any other questions, Dennis or Jeff, we should tackle right out of the gate?
No, sir.
Okay. So in that question about, Melanie, your question about the Orinda Country Club, yes, all those large parcel owners, and particularly if you take a look at the mosaic of large parcels coming from north to south, if you tile those together, particularly when you anchor around the riparian areas, the lake, and the fairways, if you tile those large parcels together, that starts to become, especially because a lot of them are oriented along an east-west axis, you start to create bands, if you will. And so the idea there becomes, and those bands happen to be in alignment with the evacuation routes. And so now we've created a layered defense consisting of really about 4 east-west fuel breaks, both interior and exterior, that will compartmentalize a fire, particularly about a fire that's jumped the line through 3-dimensional ember cast. So yes, absolutely. All of those large parcel owners are priorities, and they have the advantage. A country club, both the Moraga Country Club and the Orinda Country Club, have a very distinct advantage from my perspective, that they already have a landscaping crew. They have experience doing this work, and anything they do will be building off of either fairways or a road. Because almost all of the land they own or control is either golf course or roads that approach the golf course. And if you look at those, or in their case, the lake as well, but if you look at those areas, that's a natural place to extend the line. Fairways, for whatever it's worth, when you run a fire model across a landscape, the fuel model that's the default for fairways is NB99, which is non-burning 99, as in a golf fairway has the same burning characteristic as a parking lot, which is tremendous good news. But it also then suggests that if you work on the edges of that, you can expand that and really take out some of that, the stuff that might be used as a screening along the perimeter, that it could also be combustive vegetation and prevalence of ladder fuels. There's some work to be done there. With a modicum of work, I think we could see some real advantages. I think I saw a last question. Thinning large oaks or tall redwoods. So that's a little in the weeds for, well, I guess into the branches for the topic of the CWPP, but as a general statement, oaks are very fire resistant, and we're more worried about clearing out the duff and the litter that's underneath them. Similar idea when we talk about a redwood tree. Redwood trees in their natural state are tremendously fire resistant. But if you look at redwood trees in their natural state, there are almost no branches down low to the ground. And redwood trees, they deposit, they drop a lot of stuff. So in redwood trees, there's twofold. One is to clean up the duff litter and the branches that fall underneath and collect underneath the redwood, very important. And then to limb them up about a third of the height for young trees. And then for more mature trees, you want a minimum of 6 feet is the fire code requirement from the ground or ground fuels to the lowest portion of the canopy. So a normal sized person should be able to walk the drip line of the tree and not hit their head. The question about 10 feet immediate zone, that's all buildings. Detached garages, yes. So if fire gets established in a building of any kind, well, I take that back. It's best practice to do around all buildings. If you have a detached garage 10 feet from your house and that detached garage becomes involved, that's absolutely going to burn your house down. So creating defensible space around all of your structures is absolutely beneficial. If there's an isolated outbuilding in the middle of nowhere, I certainly would recommend clearing around it, but the implications of that igniting are much lower than buildings that are near other buildings. And typically we see with the way things are built out, structures are near structures. And if one becomes ignited, that will absolutely communicate to other homes or other structures. Buildings take a while to ignite, but when they do, they burn very hot, they burn very long, and they throw tremendous flame lengths. So it's a really good idea to clear around those. If there's any other questions, I'd encourage put them up in the chat. It's probably the easiest way to do it. All right. Well, I think that brings us to the end. So I'd say in closing for tonight, one, thank you all very much for coming. I would encourage you to please, if you know others who are interested, to draw their attention to the recording, or maybe you can save them the hour and a half you sat through here and give them the highlights. It really, I think this is a great opportunity as a community to spend some time, one time, thinking this through, get it right, and then that will be the plan that will guide our work for the next 3 years. And we can spend less time worried about what to do and more time chasing the resources to get it done when it comes to external resources, and working the partnership with the entities that are resourced to get that work done in collaboration and to get into compliance and done in a manner where each piece of work is mutually supporting to the other work. And so as this mosaic starts to expand, it's not just a little bit of work here, a little bit of work there. It's a master plan mosaic, and it all comes together. Really with an understanding, though, that I want to be very clear that there is no free pass here, that the work that's being done in the perimeter in those large parcels, that does not eliminate not only the requirement, but the need for all parcel holders to create their defensible space and to harden their homes. And taken together, I think we have a real chance to get ahead of this. We have the great gift of having lived through several of the worst fire seasons, both in memory and in recent history, without having been impacted. I will tell you that is just dumb luck. We had the luck that there was not a fire start in this community on a day and in the right place where it could spread rapidly. The firefighters have done a great job of responding and putting out those fires that could have become too big and too bad. But we've been very fortunate. The fires have been observed, and we've had a great response, and the firefighters have quickly contained them and done a great job. That doesn't mean we're always going to have the luck of that first notification. And no matter how great our firefighters and how skillful they are and how good their equipment is, if the fire hasn't been called in, they can't put it out. And so at some point, and that's what happened in other communities. So we've had an element of luck. We've also got some elements of skill and some elements where work has been done. But we have an opportunity here, informed by the terrible losses other communities have suffered. We have an opportunity to get ahead of this, and we have the gift of time to do work that was deferred or wasn't prioritized for many years. We have a chance to get ahead of that before we're back into fire season. And then just the last reminder, the fire code updates, June 1st is the new deadline. And we would encourage everyone to go out and do your work prior to June 1st, because every day we spend doing enforcement, that's a day we can't spend doing fuel mitigation. And if there's less enforcement, that means more time doing mitigation. And we really appreciate the partnership on those who are doing their work. And we'd encourage you, if you haven't already, take a look at Firewise USA. If you're in a Firewise USA neighborhood, talk to the people on the perimeter of your neighborhood. Let's look at expanding those, doing additional work within those. And then if you're in an area that's not already organized, getting organized, there's a bunch of local resources, and then people who have done it locally who are very informed and very helpful in spreading that word, as well as national resources available to the website. So with that, I'm sorry. Okay, good question there. Thank you, Dennis. Okay, well, with that, thank you everyone for your time and your participation and your interest in this topic. We look forward to receiving your input as you had a chance to think over what we talked about tonight and review the document. And we look forward to seeing you at one of the future public hearings or your input in this written form. Thank you all very much.